For a very long time, my system of placing pages into albums was lazy, to say the least. It barely existed, really. I had albums with a hodgepodge of pages inside, and mostly in order, kind of in the order they were created, plus boxes of layouts I kept meaning to get into albums, but I would always put that job off because it seemed way more fun to make another page than to get everything organized. I found myself having scrapbooked for 12 years, but if someone was in my house and asked to see a scrapbook, I really didn't have a single good example. And that was a light bulb moment. I also have the double-edged sword of living in a place that is largely unaware of scrapbooking. In America, people have some sort of idea of what you mean when you say you're a scrapbooker, but in England that same statement would be met with total confusion. The word scrapbook here really refers to a booklet of colored school paper filled with either your school certificates or magazine cutouts of your favorite pop star, and both go pretty much completely out of fashion by the time you hit 12. On one hand, it means that I have to explain what I do to strangers because I just don't have an easy answer. On the other hand, it means I can define scrapbooking in exactly the terms I like. I've tried out so many different combinations. Do I lead with the idea of photos or the idea of craft or that we make books or what? And one day I was feeling a little more dramatic and I just finished a workshop that I really loved, and when somebody asked me what I did, I described scrapbooking as a way to write down your own life story no matter what that story might be. It made sense. It got the desired result that somebody thought this was unique and worthwhile, and that was also a light bulb moment. If you put those two things together, this is where I've found my real passion in scrapbooking. I've always loved focusing on the writing. I love photography, I love crafting, but for me, it's the writing that takes a page from just something nice to something that is priceless. I believe that when we write on a page, we are writing our own life story. But if we sat down to write our own autobiography without a scrapbook, we would never approach it in this same disjointed way. Essentially, it's like we're writing an extended caption to one photo and then picking photos from an entirely different situation and writing about those and then just carrying on at random. It's not really how you would write a book about your life. So I found myself in the middle of a bit of a muddle. Creating pages at random was what made me really love the artistic side of scrapbooking. A little of this, a little of that, and the freedom to tell whatever story spoke to me that day. But it did mean I often didn't get as much from the writing as I would like. Say I scrapbooked a photo from a birthday party one day, and then I came back to more photos from that same birthday a year later. The chances that my writing would just duplicate whatever I wrote before would be pretty high. I'd just say the same thing in different words. So that wasn't really adding anything to the story, and that definitely wasn't creating an album with flow. And that is exactly what I wanted, an album that would flow from page to page, even though I might create the pages completely out of order and over the course of several years. I wanted the best of both worlds. I wanted creative freedom to work in any order and any time scale, but albums that could be flipped through at any time and make sense, really telling that life story in a way that could be accessible to someone who wasn't a scrapbooker and had no interest in gluing pretty paper to other bits of pretty paper. There had to be a way, so I found a system that worked for me, and today I'm going to tell you all about it, and you can take away the parts that inspire you, customize it to become your own system, and with a bit of luck, you'll find renewed excitement about this amazing hobby that we share. First things first, I needed to get those pages that were in boxes and stacks, I needed to get them into albums. I took one weekend and I emptied out our dining room so that I could use the biggest bit of table space and the floor. And then I set about organizing 12 years worth of pages. They were all different sizes, all different themes, all different styles. There were pages that I loved and some that were okay and some that made me wonder what on earth I was thinking. It was a huge job, but in 2 days, I had a home for every page. My system worked like this. Every calendar year gets its own album. The pages inside that album go in chronological order. When the album is full, I start a second album and I label it Volume 2. It is not rocket science. Sometimes there's something on the calendar that's so special it would take up a whole album on its own, like I would just make far too many pages, and that would distort the overall story of that year. In that case, it gets upgraded to its own album on just that theme. Some of those things are obvious, like a wedding album. Others come from events that just have lots of photographs that I just happen to enjoy scrapbooking them. So I have an entire album dedicated to a friend's costume party, for example. And I often end up with albums from friends' weddings as well as my own. And anything longer than a weekend trip usually ends up in its own album too, because I take an absolute heap of pictures when we're on the road. The yearly art albums, they start in adulthood, so I also have an early years album for pages about growing up. I've been working on this more recently, so it's now almost 2 full volumes, but that covers birth to college graduation. So really that wouldn't fit in the same system as an album for every year, because I just don't have that many photographs and things to write about from those years as I do now as a scrapbooker. And that's it. I don't further divide anything. I know that further topic division works for some people, but it's just not what speaks to me. Each album has its pages in chronological order, regardless of when they were created, so that means that old pages live right alongside new pages, and oh goodness, was that a challenge to going with the flow. But everything was organized, and it meant I could move on to the most important step. So this is where I suggest you start once you have pages and albums. Take just one album, any of the albums you have organized, but just one, and sit down with that album and with a pen and paper. No distractions. Start from the beginning, look closely, read your journaling, soak in what you've created in that album thus far. Then ask yourself what is missing. That particular album may be missing photos. You might know you have pictures on your computer that you haven't printed out that you meant to. You might have printed them out and you just haven't scrapbooked them yet. If you know there are photos that you want to include, but you haven't yet, you want to include them so the story makes sense from the beginning of the album to the end, then write that down. Make a note of those photos. That album might be missing events. If you think through the calendar, what did you do that month or that year that isn't shown there? Have you omitted anything key, like a major holiday, birthdays, anniversaries? How about special achievements like school and sporting events, changing job, moving house, or some sort of travel? If there are whole events missing that leave gaps in your story, write those down. That album might be missing explanations. When you read what you've written on your pages, does it tell the story in the most complete way, like you would hope someone would understand it? Did everything make sense? If someone reads that album and you're not there to fill in the gaps, will they be able to see what was happening in your life at that time? Do you have pages that just give bare details of an event and not much more than names, dates, or places? If certain things need more explanation, write that down on your list. Or your album may be missing perspectives. Is everything told from your point of view, even when the whole family was involved? Have you ever included words from your children, your husband, your parents, your friends? Is there anything that seems trivial in your wording now because time has changed your perspective from when you made that page? Do you look at a page with a picture of yourself 10 years ago and have more to say about it now than you did then? If your album would be more complete with additional perspective, write that down. Make a note of which pages or which events need that. Now, that's a lot of stuff to write down potentially, hence why I really suggest doing this to just one album at a time. Partly so it's not overwhelming, and partly so you can really focus on creating that story and on making pages that go with the flow. At this point, you may want to think about a workflow that will work best for you. Sometimes I keep that master list of things and I just clip it into the album and I work on it as and when. Other times, I really focus on getting one album absolutely as I want it, in which case I break out my photos and some post-it notes. Let me show you a real example of this. The biggest scrapbook project for me currently is documenting a long trip through a dozen countries. Because everything is organized in chronological order in my albums, I did the same with my photos, which means the files are really easy to bundle into folders by location on my computer. I've been printing the photos one folder at a time, and I printed 100 4x6 from the time we spent in Melbourne, Australia. When the prints arrived, I filed them the same way, and then I just scrapbooked whatever pictures grabbed my attention on any particular day. So when I sat down to evaluate this section of the album, I'd made several pages from that Melbourne folder already, and I'd scrapbooked 23 of the 100 prints. I definitely had on my list that I was missing photos, as well as explanation and perspective. It's easiest to focus on the photos first. I cleared the table and I started to evaluate my photos into how they would fit into the story. Some can be grouped by theme or event, like I had plenty of pictures of street art from an alleyway that's continually repainted with graffiti, and I had a small group of pictures from a small festival that we attended. I had 2 pictures from what became our favorite cafe, 3 from a place where we spent an afternoon, and so on for events. But then I also had maybe a dozen photos that were just a mix of things I photographed as we were out and about with no real story other than this is something cool we saw on the street in Melbourne. So the first step was getting all these pictures in one place and figuring out what topics there were, including that little stack of random pictures. And this is something you could do on your computer rather than with prints if you prefer. It's just a case of preference, and it's really easy to adapt to whichever is easiest for you. Then I opened my album and looked at what was already there. Looking at the pages so far is really, really key. I love doing this step with both Post-it notes and a variety of page protectors ready. I took those groups of pictures that could be a page on their own, and I made a space in the album by adding the page protector and marked it with a Post-it note so I knew what I wanted to include there. In this album, all the background cardstock is pretty much the same color. So I added that as I went just to make it a little easier and have that already allocated. But it's not really a requirement to make this work. If you want to pick different colors as you go, by all means you can. At the same time, you could add lots more supplies at this point if you wanted to allocate certain papers or certain colors to those photos. Of the photos I had sorted, I chose 25 that would be scrapbooked on standard 12 by 12 pages. That's not 25 different layouts, but 25 photos that would be 12 by 12 pages. And I stuck them right into the page protector so I could see where all of this would fall. And that left me with 65 prints still in my pile of photos. This is why I like a mix of page protectors. I love all the different page protectors that have photo pockets now for helping create flow in a layout. For example, I had already created 2 single 12 by 12 layouts about the time we spent in coffee school. But I still had a bunch of photos from that day and I wanted to include them, but I didn't just want page after page repetitive non-linked coffee layouts. So I picked a page protector that would hold 4 by 6 photos and journaling cards rather than just 12 by 12 pages. I used this to add 6 more photos to the coffee school part of the story without lots of what I call excess page weight, where the story seems to lag from too many pages without enough interest. I chose other divided page protectors to include more of the graffiti photos at another point in the album and a handful of the random street snapshots too. In total, I added 21 prints to photo pages, leaving me with 31 pictures still remaining in the stack. With those 31, there were no more unique stories I wanted to add. They're mostly duplicates or near duplicates, like when you take 2 or 3 photos in quick succession, and they were duplicating things that were already there in the album. Or some of them were just not as nice of shots, like they might be a little bit blurry or off center and they just weren't speaking to me. So those weren't going to go in this album. I really don't feel the need to scrapbook every picture I take, nor every picture I print. But I also don't want to dismiss something I may have taken a lot of photos of just because I liked it. Like if we took pictures of either of us in front of something cool. So in this case, I had 8 pictures that we were in, but I'd already used several similar shots in the album. So those 8 pictures, I put them back in my photo drawer and just filed them as a reference to that they could be useful in some other story. Not specific to the travel, but perhaps a page about either of us and things that we like or things like that. That left 23 prints out of the original 100, and those are the 23 that just didn't make the cut. I have a box where I sort random prints that I'm just not likely to scrapbook, but if you're more comfortable with clearing them out entirely by giving them to someone else or throwing them away, you can do that. Or you can keep them in your files if you prefer to keep everything archived along the way. Just whatever. This is a step in favor of doing this process before you order your prints, perhaps. But personally, I just put projects off if I don't have the actual pictures right in front of me. And your work ethic may be strong enough to wait for the prints, but mine isn't. With the evaluation side done, you either have an outline of pages to finish as time allows, or you have a perfect project to take with you to a crop or one whole day of scrapbooking at your house if you want to finish all those pages in a dedicated session. Either option can work. It's just a case of seeing what fits both your schedule and your creative process. Like I said before, I really love making my pages in random order, so it's rare that I would want to sit down and scrapbook all of these in the same day or week. But because the album is partially finished and easy to flip through, I'm more likely to finish a page here and there over the next couple weeks, and that works for me. That's a very specific example. Now let's look at some more general steps for taking action on an album and creating flow. You've already done the evaluation process and have those steps to hand. You may or may not already have your photos printed. When you flip through what's already in the album, look for places to add whole pages. That might be full pages, partial pages, or photo pages. Partial pages are any size smaller than the standard page size for your album, so anything usually smaller than 12 by 12. You can add in an 8.5 by 11 or 6 by 12 amongst the 12 by 12, or you can add a fold out page from something 8 by 12 where you've taken a 12 by 12 page protector and just trimmed it down, and then you can attach that like by sewing it or taping it to another page protector so it folds out, or you can just go ahead and adhere it so it's the same, it flips like any other page, but it's just slightly smaller. There's all sorts of different ways you can customize that and play with the size of different pages. And for the most part, all different size page protectors still fit that same standard 3-ring spot. So usually you don't have to do any adapting. If you do, all you really have to do is use a hole punch on a page protector. You can also use photo pages. Those are the divided page protectors made for 4x6 or any other size of photos. It's easy to add 4x6 photos here and there, and they don't need any embellishment. But keep in mind that you can add things like labels and smaller embellishments straight to the photos, and you can replace any of the photo spaces with a journaling card so you still have plenty of room to write. In addition to pages, you can add hold-alls. These include pockets to hold more photos and paper souvenirs like maps or programs or extended writing. Or instead of pockets, you can use accordion folded cardstock, and you can add that to a layout so that in the space where you would normally have one picture, you can fold it out, and that will become a great hold-all since you can keep extending it for as much space as you need. You can even add a whole notepad to your album if you want extended writing in a hold-all. You can write it all out or type it all out in paper and glue an envelope inside the cover and put it in there. Or you can take a whole notepad that you really like and have written all your journaling out by hand, and you can actually glue it to the inside of your album. You can also add references. I try to remember the rule of referencing rather than duplicating. This particularly goes for really prolific scrapbookers who might already have made pages or mini books about a specific event, and now you're working on pages with more photos from that same day. If you made a mini book or some other project about something that's important and you feel the story's already been told, just reference it by making a page, just one page, in that perspective, like a review perhaps. And then add small print to that page that really does say something along the lines of, see more about this in the blue album. This whole process of making an album that goes with the flow is really not about making extra work for yourself. So if you find something that's missing because it's in another album, you don't need to make extra work and repeat all that stuff. The process is about still making pages in the same way you enjoy, just taking a moment now and then to look at how each page fits into a bigger and even more lovely project. So I just leave those notes rather than duplicate information from a mini book or another layout. In fact, when I make an upgrade album and separate an event out from my regular yearly albums, I leave one layout in the yearly album with a note to say, see more in that other book. That way, when anyone flips through from page to page, they still see a true story of what happened over the course of the year. And if they want more detail about any of those special topics, they can look at a whole nother book on that topic. Of course, if you're nowhere near worrying about duplication and you're more concerned about just getting ideas from your head onto the paper, you don't need to worry about the referencing step at all. And maybe it will come into play later at a later date when you've created lots more pages. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. So far, we've talked a great deal about photos and page ideas, and even a bit about writing, but there's a whole other side we haven't discussed, and that's the visual. As crafters, we love the visual. It's what attracts us to this creative exercise of moving things from here to there until we get the page just how we want. But until recently, there seems to have been just two schools of thought on how to use supplies on our pages. One school seemed to suggest that every single page should be made with a unique blend of supplies, so each page was different and very different to the last. This is particularly obvious with themed papers and embellishments. Like, I'm not going to use back-to-school themed papers for a trip to Disney World, and I'm not going to use my Disney papers for the company Christmas party, and no Christmas parties for a trip to the pumpkin patch. But it goes for papers that aren't obviously themed too. Some scrapbookers rarely go back to a paper that they've cut up for one layout because the paper's already on a page and they feel it shouldn't appear on a second unrelated page. The opposing school of thought promoted the idea of selecting one set of supplies and using them for an entire album, so every page from start to finish would have the same color scheme, the same patterns and fonts with no deviation. This made it economical and often quicker to create, but it could also drain the fun from making those creative choices with colors and patterns and textures. So personally, I'm sitting with another camp right in the middle. I believe it's okay, and it's even awesome, to use a paper once and then mix it up with other supplies and use it again somewhere else on another page in another album or the same album. I believe it's okay to come up with just one or two easy decisions for unifying the visual, like one color of cardstock for all the backgrounds or a repeated motif, without needing all the pages to use the same selection of supplies. And the real kicker, I believe it's okay to add to or subtract from a layout I've already completed. So take those coffee school layouts as an example. I made the two pages at completely different times, and they only had a little bit in common. They both had craft cardstock backgrounds, and they both had brown and green somewhere in the pattern paper just by luck. They didn't use the same pattern papers, and they didn't use the same letter stickers, fonts, anything like that. Then I decided I want to add this photo page in between them and include some blocks for journaling and embellishment. How do I make all of this come together and go from two unconnected layouts and a stack of photos to 4 pages that feel like a unified set? How can we create that flow? First, I looked at the papers on both pages and dug through my scraps to see if I had any leftovers from these. I had a few little bits and also some scraps that were pretty similar and might do in a pinch. Then I pulled out all the alphabet stickers I'd used. I knew I didn't have any more of the embellishments that I'd used on either layout. One had 3D flowers and the other had stickers with a blue floral pattern, but both were long gone from my stash. So I tried to find something that would fit, but also be quite neutral and not really draw attention to the mismatched embellishments. I ended up with some small stamp shape stickers and some adhesive chipboard pieces. Using all those supplies together, I could mix the patterns from the first page with the patterns from the second page and do the same with the lettering. Each side of the photo pages ended up with a 4x12 title block, 3 4x6 photos, and 1 4x6 journaling block. I didn't open any new packages, I didn't cut into any full sheets, everything was from cutoffs and leftovers, and yet the photo page adds more value to both the story and the visual flow from page to page. I am totally on board with that, getting something that really helps my albums from what was essentially deemed as waste. It's worth knowing that the more specific your style, the easier it is to create visual flow. You may know the kind of style that I mean when you see a scrapbook page and you know who made it without being told. Not just because you recognize the people in the photographs, but because the crafter has a set of visual trademarks she repeats in most of her designs. She might always use the same color in the background, or always use the same letter stickers, or always splash paint or stitch the edges or print her photos at a certain size. Whatever her trademark might be, she has a very specific style. A specific style will create visual flow in an album without needing much extra attention because there are elements that repeat. But don't worry if your style isn't that specific. There are plenty of ways you can include repetition without needing all your pages to look very similar. Think about the tools you use. Do you have a certain punch or die cut shape that you use often? Repeating a shape throughout your album can also allow you to work in lots of different color palettes and patterns while also having something consistent. The same goes for a stamped image or a repeated font. Think of it like the score to a film. Often a character or an emotion will have a certain song that plays quietly in the background, and soon you begin to associate the character with that song. If it's a superhero film, the music may not even be quiet at all and instead announce a character with like blaring trumpets. You can decide if you want your visual flow to come from something small and subtle or something big and bold that you just can't miss. When I review an album and I want to add visual flow, I follow these steps. I look for scraps of the same supplies and add them into the mix when possible. If I don't have scraps of those, I choose something similar or complementary. And I accept that just one tiny thing dotted here and there is an absolutely perfect way of adding visual flow without needing to overthink or constrict my creativity. And then I take one final step when I place that layout in my album. I look to see if I want to add anything to the pages before and after to make them work with what I've just added. Sometimes I'll add a few more punch shapes or stickers or a few sentences of writing that didn't fit on the layout that I just finished. That doesn't mean remaking layouts at all. I'm not taking layouts apart and reconstructing them or printing the photos again and starting from scratch. This is just a tiny, tiny little job, just a minute or two, and I definitely don't do this every day. But sometimes finishing one page makes me realize how another page could be even lovelier with just a little something. And in that case, I'll add it, pop it back to the album, and carry on. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground here, but I hope it's something you'll consider, and if nothing else, gather a group of pages and put them in an album you love. When someone asks you about scrapbooking, be able to pass them that album and say, this is what it's all about. Have at least one album that makes sense to everyone, whether they speak the language of scrapbooking or not. Remember, you are the editor of your own life story, and this wonderful hobby gives you the potential to make amazing pages, and with just a little thought, those pages can add up to something even greater, and your albums may just make you the happiest scrapbooker anybody has ever met. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you'll stop by my blog at www.shimelle.com to keep in touch and share your favorite scrapbooking projects. Enjoy True Scrap!